The year is 1960. An oil company worker in Caracas, let's call him Mario, wraps up his day like any normal person. He cashes his paycheck, stops by a store, buys imported coffee, and as he looks at cars in a showroom window on the way home, he thinks about his plans for the next month. Maybe a trip abroad, a new car, a future that feels predictable. Now it's 2026. Imagine you have the same job, in the same city, in the same country as Mario. You wake up before sunrise, not to head to the site, not to start the shift, but to stand in line. You've learned a new survival calendar, pharmacy days, bread days, diaper days. You don't ask, what do I want? You ask, what's available today? Your monthly salary hits your account, and before you can blink, it's already shrinking. Not metaphorically, literally. Prices are moving faster than your life can. So you do what millions do in a collapsing currency. You convert your salary into anything that holds value: food, soap, dollars, batteries. Because in hyperinflation, money becomes a melting ice cube. But here's the part that hurts the most. It isn't just the shortages. It's the sensation that the future has been stolen. You can't plan, you can't save, you can't breathe. And the cruelest detail is this. This wasn't a sudden disaster. This was a timeline. Because Venezuela didn't wake up one day and become poor. Venezuela was dismantled step by step, by mechanisms that seemed reasonable at the time. That's what we're doing today, a causal timeline. Not dates as trivia, dates as fuses. Each decision lights the next fuse, and the acceleration builds until the economy hits the wall. And when we reach the end, we're going to ask a question that makes people uncomfortable, because it should. If a country that rich could fall this far, what are the warning signs for everyone else, including the United States? But to understand how everyday life in Venezuela became a collapse in 2026, we need to go back to the moment the first piece was quietly placed on the board. Because collapse doesn't start with empty shelves, it starts with wealth. In the mid-20th century, Venezuela is not seen as a failure story. It's seen as a success story. By global standards, Venezuela is unusually wealthy per person, an oil exporter with rising living standards, modernizing cities, imported goods, a sense of momentum. In fact, for a period in the post-war decades, Venezuela's income per capita even surpassed that of countries like Germany, France, and Japan. And much of the oil machine behind that prosperity wasn't built by the Venezuelan state at first. It was built through foreign private capital, including major American oil companies that financed and operated fields, pipelines, ports, and refineries under concession. And here's the first invisible mechanism, one most people miss. When wealth arrives fast, the country learns the wrong lesson. It learns, this is who we are now, not this is what oil prices are doing right now. Because oil wealth has a personality. It pays for things you didn't build. It funds consumption without demanding productivity. And if you're not careful, it rewires your politics. This is the seed of the resource curse. Not that oil guarantees collapse, but that oil makes it easy to build an economy where the fight is over control of rents, not creation of value. And that is how the timeline begins. Venezuela is wealthy, but the engine is narrow. And narrow engines don't forgive mistakes. And when the engine is controlled by the state, the next fuse is almost inevitable. In 1976, Venezuela nationalizes oil. Now, let's be precise. A state oil company isn't automatically a death sentence. Plenty of countries manage it well. But nationalization shifts the center of gravity. The main source of dollars now flows through the political system. That changes incentives. Because when the state controls the oil spigot, the most important business strategy becomes access. Not innovation, not efficiency, access. This is the first fuse. When the state becomes the gatekeeper of dollars, Politics becomes the economy. And once politics becomes the economy, the next step is almost scripted. During booms, spending explodes, because booms feel like proof that the model works. And the boom that follows doesn't just bring money, it brings a new addiction. Oil prices surge, revenues swell, and the country spends. Some of that spending is real progress, roads, programs, public employment, but the mechanism underneath is deadly. Temporary booms fund permanent bills. This is where the trap tightens. Because once society adjusts to a high-revenue lifestyle, any future drop doesn't feel like a correction. It feels like theft. And governments learn a lesson. You must keep the lifestyle going, even when the oil cycle turns. This is the moment that looks like an economic miracle, but in a long historical timeline, it's also the moment the economy signs a contract with a volatile commodity. And when the commodity swings down, the next fuse lights, currency stress, and the temptation to control it. In 1983, the Bolivar breaks. Devaluation controls Venezuela's Black Friday. And here's the key. A currency crisis is not just a financial event, it's a social event, because money is trust. Money is a promise that tomorrow will resemble today enough to plan a life. Once the currency breaks, behavior changes. People stop saving in local money. Businesses price defensively. Imports become a battlefield. The economy becomes less about growth and more about survival hedges. And that creates the political poison. Every government after this point is governing a public that fears instability. Now watch the causal chain. Currency stress leads to controls. Controls create distortions. Distortions breed resentment. And that resentment explodes a few years later. Because when resentment meets austerity, history doesn't whisper, it shouts. In 1989, price hikes and austerity help ignite the Caracazo, mass unrest, violence, trauma. This isn't just a riot, it's a national memory. And here's what it does to the timeline. It teaches politicians that reform can be fatal, so they become addicted to delay. This is one of the most important causal pivots. When reform becomes politically toxic, governments search for painkillers, not cures. They promise stability without cost. They try to buy time, and buying time is expensive, which sets up the next fuse. A fragile financial system cracks. In the mid-1990s, Venezuela suffers a banking crisis, and every banking crisis does the same thing. It corrodes legitimacy. People watch institutions fail, watch bailouts happen, watch rules bend. They conclude, the system protects someone. It doesn't protect me. When that belief spreads, it creates demand for political outsiders, leaders who promise to smash the old order. So the banking crisis doesn't just damage balance sheets, it damages the social contract. And now the timeline is primed for a new model, one that promises control, justice, and certainty. And when a society wants certainty more than freedom, the next fuse is already lit. By 1999, Venezuela chooses a new direction, more state control, more redistribution, more centralized power, framed as moral correction. Here's the historian's job. We don't reduce this to slogans. We look at incentives. A commodity economy with low trust creates the perfect environment for a promise. Hand us the wheel, we'll drive to stability. But stability isn't produced by control alone. Stability is produced by institutional credibility, rules, data, restraint, competence. If control expands while institutions weaken, you don't get stability. You get a fragile system that only appears stable when oil money is flowing. And that brings us to the critical fuse. A shock hits the oil sector, and the government responds with controls so tight they rewire the economy. To solve the problem of instability, they build a machine that manufactures scarcity. In 2002 and 2003, The oil sector is disrupted, the economy stumbles, and the political battle intensifies. The response is decisive: controls, especially over foreign currency. This is a turning point because Venezuela is an import-dependent society. No dollars means no medicine, no parts, no food inputs, no industrial supplies. So when the government ration controls dollars, it doesn't eliminate scarcity. It chooses winners and losers inside scarcity. Now add the solution that feels compassionate: price controls. This is the classic false cure, because if you freeze prices below reality, producers stop producing, importers can't replenish, shelves empty. And then the black market is not a moral failure, it's an economic reflex. So the mechanism becomes a loop. Controls create shortages, shortages justify more controls, and more controls deepen shortages. This is the moment the trap is armed, and once the trap is armed, the next fuse is inevitable. Capacity begins to rot, quietly, invisibly, until it collapses. Over the next years, state intervention deepens. More nationalizations, more political control over sectors that require technical competence. And here is where collapses are born, not in headlines, but in maintenance schedules. Oil production is not a switch. It's a machine. So are power grids. So are supply chains. When investment becomes unpredictable, when management becomes political, when expertise is replaced by loyalty, capacity bleeds out. At first, the country still looks functional because it's spending oil money and importing the gaps. That's the illusion. The system is already weaker. It just hasn't met the shock that exposes it. And then the shock arrives. Because once you've built a country that runs on oil dollars, a global oil crash doesn't just hurt, it detonates. In 2014, oil prices drop hard. A diversified economy bends. A dependent economy snaps. Because oil wasn't just Venezuela's export. It was the fuel for the entire import system. When oil revenue collapses, imports collapse, and the shortages go from frustrating to existential. Now look at the timeline causality. By 2014, Venezuela already has controls, distortions, and weakened capacity. So the normal adjustment mechanisms, investment, production response, credit access, are either muted or broken. The country can't adapt quickly, so it does what trapped governments often do. It tries to maintain spending by expanding money creation. And here's the grim math. When production falls and money printing rises, the currency stops being money. By this stage, the options are brutal. Cut spending, raise taxes, borrow or print. Borrowing becomes increasingly constrained. Cutting spending risks political explosion. So printing expands. But printing money doesn't create goods. It creates claims on goods. If goods are shrinking and claims are multiplying, prices don't just rise, they run. This is when hyperinflation destroys the most important thing an economy needs: coordination. People think inflation is prices going up, but hyperinflation is the destruction of calculation. How do you price a product when the currency changes value between morning and afternoon? How do you sign contracts? How do you pay workers? How do you import? Now the collapse becomes visible in daily life. Salaries evaporate, savings vanish, shelves empty, doctors leave, engineers leave, families split across borders. And yes, during this period, external pressures like sanctions and financial isolation intensify constraints and complicate recovery. But the internal mechanics, controls, collapsing capacity, and money financing already built the runway for hyperinflation. This is what causal history looks like. By the time the world is paying attention, the end game has been engineered. And once money fails, society finds a replacement, often unofficial, unequal, and painful. Eventually, Venezuela partially stabilizes, not by fixing the system, but by bypassing it. People use dollars informally. Transactions move outside the broken currency. This can slow the bleeding. Goods can reappear for those with access to hard currency. But this is not a return to prosperity. It's triage. A patient is not healthy because the hemorrhage slowed. They're alive. That's different. And here's the hidden danger of survival mode. It can make the collapse look like it's over, when in reality, the foundations are still cracked. Dollarization can keep markets moving, but it can't rebuild institutions, restore capacity, or repair legitimacy. So the timeline doesn't end here. It enters a new phase, a weaker state, a fractured society, and a power vacuum that invites pressure from the outside. Now, imagine a final flash forward, one that shows where this kind of collapse can lead when sovereignty itself becomes fragile. And then we reach January 2026, the moment this stops being only an economic story and becomes a story of sovereignty. After weeks of mounting pressure on Venezuela's maritime routes, the United States launched a rapid operation. U.S. officials said they had captured the Venezuelan leader and removed him from the country. But in real time, we have to separate two crucial questions: the fall of a leader versus the fall of a regime. Because dictatorships are machines, security networks, patronage systems, parallel institutions, and those machines can survive the removal of a single person. And this is the final fuse the timeline was always converging toward. When an economy collapses so far that it can no longer reliably fund loyalty, import legitimacy, stabilize prices, or offer dignity to its own population, it fragments, it becomes unsustainable. And that weakness creates openings, internal fractures, and external intervention. So January 2026 may be the peak of the collapse. The next chapter is whether the machine comes apart or simply finds a new operator, which is why the real question now isn't what happened. It's what happens next, because removing a ruler is fast, rebuilding institutions is slow, and history punishes countries that confuse the two. So let's extract the warning signs, the mechanics, that every major power should recognize early, including the United States. Let's be responsible here. The U.S. is not Venezuela. The U.S. has a far larger and more diversified economy, stronger institutions, deeper capital markets, and the world's reserve currency. Those differences matter. But the lesson of Venezuela is not that everyone ends the same. The lesson is that certain mechanisms are dangerous in any country. When politics replaces prices, reality doesn't disappear. Reality relocates. It moves into shortages, black markets, and corruption. You can call it compassion. You can call it justice. But if your policy destroys the signal system of the economy stops coordinating. That's not ideology, that's mechanics. And once you break signals, the next temptation is to replace them with control. Venezuela's engine was oil. For other countries, it can be one sector, one bubble, one cheap credit cycle, one geopolitical advantage. The rule is simple. If you build a lifestyle on a narrow engine, shocks become existential, and existential shocks make governments do extreme things. And extreme policies require one more ingredient to become permanent: weak institutions. Institutional credibility is the shock absorber. It's what stops a bad year from becoming a lost decade. When institutions become politicized, when data is massaged, when central banks become printers, when rules become flexible for friends, then crises stop being corrected and start being amplified. And that's the final link in the chain. Not bad luck, but the inability to self-correct. So here is the timeline in one sentence. Oil wealth created dependence. Dependence made currency crises lethal. Currency crises made reform politically toxic. Toxic reform produced control regimes. Control regimes created shortages and black markets. Capacity rotted. Then the oil crash exposed the rot. Money printing finished the job. Venezuela's collapse wasn't a mystery. It was a sequence. And in the next videos, we're going to tackle some harder questions. How countries recover after a collapse, what actually works, what doesn't, and why miracle cures usually end up planting the seeds of the next disaster. If you can see the timeline, you can see the fuses before they burn. So if you don't want to miss what's next, subscribe to catch the next episodes.